How's it going, YouTube? Coming today with another video, and today, guys, what I'm bringing to you is going to be my top 5 tips and tricks as to how you can get better at Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, this is something that I really wanted to make because there's so many different ways that you can improve, but I always feel like it's the best from a player's perspective, especially if you've been to a ton of events. And I think that this in particular is really going to showcase how I look at events and the things that I think about. So if you did learn something today, definitely let me know what you thought about it down in the comments below. I really love just hearing a lot of the constructive feedback from everyone, but I really do think that these help me on a daily basis, especially at my bigger tournaments. So I do hope that these do help you improve. If you haven't already checked out my sponsors over on Imperium, Dragon Shield, Grimoire, Gem, check them all out down in the description below. I appreciate you all. Thank you all for being sponsors of the channel, and thank you all for supporting the channel. I really do appreciate it. But I'm really excited to make this video today, as I really do feel like it's going to be impactful for you. So the first thing that I want to talk about today is actually being able to make reasonable assumptions during your matches. And what I mean by this is, if your opponent does something, you kind of have to know where they're going with it. And so the best way for me to show you is something that happened on DB. This actually happened while I was streaming, and I use this as an example later on when I was coaching, and I thought that it was just a very good example. So let's say that your opponent is activating Pot of Prosperity. They have 3 cards in hand. Their reveal is going to be Thrust, Book of Moon, Storm, Avian, Terraforming, and Duality. Now, the first reasonable assumption is that they're on Floowandereeze, because you see Apex Avian and you see Storm. So the other thing too is when you see Duality plus Prosperity, you already know it's a deck that can't special summon that turn, or it doesn't want to. So this is something where, even though this is fairly obvious as to what the deck is, in 6 cards, you need to be able to gain as much knowledge as possible so you know where your negates need to go down. It's also nice seeing a Thrust here, because if they don't add the Thrust, then you know that there's a less likelihood that they open the Thrust. So if you want to interact with your opponent, the chances of them actually hard opening that one Thrust are a lot lower, especially in 3 cards being in their hand. So it's also very important. The other reasonable assumption that you can make is after they make their selection. So we see Thrust, Terraforming, and Duality. Now we're going to assume that they're probably not going to grab the Book of Moon, the Storm, or the Avian. Trying to play into a board right now, I think the best options for the most part would be Thrust, Terraforming, and Duality. It really does depend on what their hand's looking like. Of course, Terraforming gets to map. Thrust is able to get to quite a lot, especially just talent alone being such an impactful card. And then Duality seems like the worst pick here, just because you're going to be digging a little further, where map is already a card that's stellar to have. Thrust is a fantastic card if you're getting interrupted. But then you see your opponent add Duality. Now, what's the next reasonable assumption that you can make? So if my opponent left Terraforming and Thrust, I'm going to assume that my opponent probably doesn't have a bird, because if they're going to be trying to Duality into something else, what more could you realistically want besides a Thrust going second or the Terraforming for map? So this is actually the case of what happened in the match, was that my opponent just didn't have a bird. So it meant that this Duality had to resolve. And if you're at that point, potentially even ashing that Duality doesn't seem that bad. They're also ripping the Prosperity first, which means that they're openly allowing themselves to be playing into Droll. So there's a lot of different things that you can think about whenever your opponent's going to be doing a play like this. So I really do think that this is important to know, especially just the fact that if you ever see a Duality go to hand, you really know that your opponent's struggling to find a card that they need, and let alone a starter. So the next one here is going to be pick a card and play around it, because realistically, you can't always play around everything. This is something that's really hard to do. So at the regional, this is something that did happen as well, and my opponent played perfectly. I really do think that the line that my opponent chose was great, and this is a great example of picking one card and playing around it. So if you're playing against a deck like Branded Chimera, you know that Super Poly and Imperm are both very real cards. But if your opponent sets one and passes, you really have to decide which card you're going to play around. You can probably make another reasonable assumption that it's probably Super Poly, because otherwise the Imperm would have been held in hand. but there's also like mind games that you can play by like setting an imperm, or if they set like 2 cards and then you're trying to play around like the 1 card that you're gonna have a problem with. So the play was normal summon connector, and then the connector got ashed. So my opponent went summon Fireflint Lady, and then proceeded to go ahead and summon Oliver, which played into Super Poly, but making the Angelica there play it around Imperm perfectly. So you realistically have to just pick a card and play around it, because there's so many different situations you have to think about whenever you're trying to push through a board. Even if it's a very minimal board and your opponent doesn't really do anything and they pass, you kind of have to assume that there's a potential blowout waiting. And that's something where it could be like the only card that lets them win. And so again, you really have to just think about what the likelihood of the card that is set could be, and then just go around that. Especially if you're playing blind into a board and your opponent just sets one and passes turn 1, game 1. This is something where you just kind of have to make the assumption that that is some kind of interruption, and it's probably not Imperm, because they would have just held that in their hand. So definitely something to think about, but this is the reason why we say don't like just blind MST, right? Because the 50-50 is never worth it, because you always want to like wait and see if there's a floodgate as well. This is kind of very similar, but you really want to make sure that you're just trying to play around the one that you can the most. The next one here is knowing what is left in an extra deck. Now this is by and large the one thing that I always tell everyone, because it judges their follow-up and how real it is. So if you're playing against a deck, let's say Striker, because it's one that a lot of people are very familiar with. If your opponent has 2 Kagaris in the graveyard, 2 Shizukus, their Azaleas in the graveyard, their Dark Charmers in the graveyard, and let's say both Hayate are in the graveyard, right? And your opponent only has like 6 cards left in their extra deck, you have to be able to guess what those cards are. Now, if there's only 2 Kagari and 2 Shizuku in the graveyard, you know there's 1 Kagari, 1 Shizuku left. If you haven't seen Zeke yet, you know Zeke is still there, so that's 3. Access code is a staple, and that's something that you usually will see, and so that's 4. Now, you have 2 slots left. One is usually a flex spot in Striker, so you can see like the Albion that used to be there. There used to be a Mirror Jade there. It could potentially be a Zeus, maybe even a Super Poly target for the sideboard Super Poly. And then the last card could be a unicorn that is very common, or it could just be a second Charmer. So these are things that are really important, because if you can guess what the follow-up of your opponent could be based on what's in their extra deck, then you can go very far with what you can let happen. So if your opponent activates a card, you know if you have to stop it or not, because you know what they can get into, right? If they still have 1 Kagari left, then you're probably just saving that last negation for the 1 Kagari. Because if you're not afraid of getting blown out by like access code, or you don't think that you could lose to 1, then the only card that you're stopping there is going to be Kagari. And this can be rolled over to many different matchups, right? So especially if you're playing against like Unchained, and you have like 1 Soul of Rage gone, you have 1 Yama. Some lists play 2, some lists play 3. You kind of have to look at what the general opinion is on how many you'd run. But you can guess if there's 5 cards left and they only used 1 Yama, that there could be 2 in the extra deck. There could still be 1 Soul of Rage. There could be a Zeus. There's so many things that could be, but you kind of have to know like what the general builds are, and then be able to gauge what the follow-up is going to be. And I think that's really important. That wins me multiple games, usually just because I know what I can negate and what's actually real. Because if you just start negating things because you're worried about what they could do, imagine if you just had that knowledge to be like, there's not a whole lot they have left except this one thing. I'm just going to wait and negate that one thing. That goes a really long way. The next thing I want to bring up here is look at what is being played in your pod. Now, what I mean by that is if you're at an event like a regional or YCS, pay attention the next time that you're at one. Because if you look at the table around you, look 3 to your left and 3 to your right, as you move forward, those players who are winning will move forward with you, and you'll inevitably play against them. It won't always happen, but it happens more than you think. So if you're paying attention to the people around you at your table, there's a higher chance that you're going to see them later on. And the reason why I have D-Shifter here is because this actually happened at the regional in PA this past weekend. So my last opponent, I saw him in round 7. And I remember this like very last second where I saw the playmat in my head. I was trying to remember what it was. And then I just remember seeing a D-Shifter hit the playmat. And I was like, oh, he's on cash. So when I hit the last round, I was going first. I was like, it's cash. And I knew. And so this is something where you will play against the people in your pod. It will happen. So just make sure that you are paying attention to that, because that's really important. That information, when you get to go first in your matches, is gigantic, because you're not going to put up things you wouldn't put up normally, right? Like if you know that you're playing against tier, you're going to put up that dweller, right? So it's really important. The last thing here, and probably the most important above all, is make sure your sideboard is correct. I cannot tell you the number of times where I look at someone's list after an event and just see how incorrect some of the choices were, or just maybe not enough theory put in, because this goes even deeper now with like siding Druis Worm and not Magnemite. Just playing like 3 Druis is really huge right now. Next format, going in after this ban list in AGov, cards like Lancia are pretty solid. Zombie World's very solid. D-Barrier is an FTK against multiple decks. If you want to play the Cosmics because Runic is going to be really popular, then play the Cosmics. Otherwise, playing Lightning Storm and Duster is really important, because you can go ahead and just get the massive blowout out of nowhere. But you also got to realize playing as Labyrinth that probably won't even get that far, because there's Butler now. So that means Erad's very real, very fast. Your sideboard is going to make or break your matches. It just will. And this is something where in your testing, I implore you to go ahead, and if you're playing against people that you know and you're just testing, in games 2 and 3, look at your deck, pull that side card to your hand like the Phantasme, and just start with it in your hand while you're testing. Because if you are testing like 6 matches, right, and you only open Phantasme 1 time, you're gonna be like, that card sucked, it never came up, but you never tried it. You need to put it into your hand and actually use it in matches so you know if it's good. Make it your 6th card when you're going second. Make it your 5th card so you actually have it when they're playing. These are really important things to do when you're testing, to make sure that you're actually getting the best use out of your side cards, because you might go to an event and be like, you know, Phantasme is the best card. I'm going to play this card because everyone tells me to play this card. And then you bring it to the event and it does nothing. It does nothing because you didn't test it. And now you have a sideboard that is super lopsided because it's not, like, having your sideboard's not doing anything. Whereas if you put in the time and you actually tested those pieces in your sideboard, they're going to do well and do well for you. And that's something that I can't talk about enough. Please just start using your side effectively, testing your side effectively, because most of your games that you play are post side. And this is something that you really have to know. And if above all else, this is the only thing that you learned today, please let me know down in the comments below, because this is extremely important. I do hope that you all enjoyed today's video, my top 5 tips and tricks to improve at the game. This is something that I really love to do. I love being able to play. I love being able to give back and teach and do the best that I can to make sure that everyone's up to date on information. So if you do like the information that you're hearing, subscribe to the channel. Almost at 19,200 away. Very exciting stuff there. Definitely join the Discord, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, or if you want a coaching session, definitely hit me up over on Metafy. And everyone have a wonderful night. I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you.